The girl carrying laundry stopped when she heard the paper. Not the words. She was too far from the counter for words. But the sound it made when the man slid it across the pine boards. A crackle, thin and dry, the sound of something official being finished. The boy standing at the counter did not reach for it. His hands stayed at his sides. The men behind him shifted their weight, and one of them cleared his throat in the way men clear their throats when they want to seem kind while doing something that is not kind at all. The boy's fingers finally moved. He folded the paper once, twice, and pressed it inside his coat. Then he asked a question that made the storekeeper's mouth tighten. He wanted to know whether the deed included the rear chamber. The deed was still warm from Victor Maud's hand when Isaac Vale stepped onto the porch of the company store and felt the sleet hit his neck. He folded the paper once, then again, and pushed it inside his coat lining where the wool had worn through to canvas. The paper crackled against his ribs. He was 16 years old. He had $12.30 in a tobacco tin, no legal guardian, no winter room, and no living relative within 400 miles of Colorado's San Juan mining country. 3 months earlier, his father Rowan had died under a tramcar on a wet Thursday when the brake lever snapped and the loaded ore cart rolled backward down 40 feet of track. The relief committee had settled the estate in the way such committees settled the affairs of dead men who owed more than they earned. They sold Rowan's 2 usable tools, a crosscut saw and a number 4 pick, for $6 combined, applied the money against $19.60 of unpaid board at Maud's house, and assigned Isaac the remaining balance in the form of property. The property was a played-out horizontal mine tunnel called Grouse Blind No. 2, drilled 80 feet into barren granite on the east side of the Upper Animas Valley, abandoned 3 years prior when the vein pinched to nothing and worth exactly what the committee needed it to be worth, enough on paper to declare the boy no longer the town's burden. Maud had made the motion himself. He told the council minutes that the boy now had property, so the camp need not carry him through winter. The men around the table had nodded because nodding cost nothing, and winter was 5 weeks away, and nobody wanted another mouth when flour cost what it cost at 12,000 feet. Isaac stood on the porch and watched the sleet turn the mud street to glass. He owned a mule blanket, his father's brass pocket watch, an alcohol thermometer cracked at the top but still readable below 60 degrees, a hand auger, 2 chisels, and a short-handled shovel. He did not own a stove. He did not own a single cord of wood. He did not own enough food to last 2 weeks, let alone the 4 months between first deep snow and spring thaw. The math was not complicated. Maud's cheapest cot cost $1 a week, paid ahead, no credit for orphans. Flour ran 40 cents a pound this late in the season, freighted up from Silverton by mule train on a road that would close the moment heavy snow hit. Stovewood was already spoken for. Men had been stacking since August, and the going rate for a split cord had climbed to $9. Even if Isaac spent every cent in his tobacco tin on shelter and food, he would be broke and homeless by mid-November with 3 months of winter still ahead. He could not walk out. The road south to Silverton dropped through 11 miles of canyon with no settlement between. He had no horse, no snowshoes, and no guarantee of work at the bottom. The road north climbed higher before it went anywhere. East and west were mountains that killed experienced men in October. He pressed his thumb against the folded deed inside his coat and felt the paper's edge like a blade against his ribs. Cheap. 2 days later, Amos Quayle came to look at the hole. Quayle was 61, a former mine captain who now served as the town's inspection man, the person who walked shafts after rock falls, checked timber sets before crews went back in, and signed the paper that said a tunnel would not kill whoever entered it next. He had buried 11 men across 30 years in Colorado mining country. He walked with the careful gait of a man who understood that the ground was always deciding whether to hold you or swallow you. He found Isaac at the portal of grouse blind number 2 with a candle lantern, a piece of charcoal, and the cracked thermometer. The portal faced east, cut into a low granite bluff about 40 paces from the creek. The opening was roughly 6 feet wide and 5.5 at the crown, framed by raw rock that had never been timbered. Loose shale hung above the mouth in flakes the size of a man's hand. The sill was wet. Snowmelt and seep water ran in a thin sheet across the floor and drained sluggishly toward the creek. Quayle took the lantern from Isaac without asking, ducked his head, and walked inside. Isaac followed. Their boots splashed. The ceiling dripped. Quayle stopped every 20 paces and held the lantern up, studying the rock the way a doctor studies a wound, not with hope, but with the professional patience of someone cataloging what has already gone wrong. He came back out after 10 minutes, handed the lantern to Isaac, and wiped his hands on his coat. 6 feet wide, Quayle said. 5.5 at the crown, wet sill, loose shale above the mouth, no proper door, no cribbing for the first 20 feet. He looked at Isaac with the flat expression of a man delivering a verdict he had delivered before. You have a hole, not a house. Isaac said nothing. Quayle told him what a conventional winter required at this altitude. A tight cabin, 12 by 16 feet minimum, with walls chinked against wind. A roof pitched steep enough to shed snow before the weight broke the ridgepole. 4 to 6 cords of wood split and stacked before December. And 6 was safer than 4. A stove with proper pipe. Food for 2 months at minimum, 3 if the road closed early. Neighbors close enough to hear trouble if trouble came at night. You have none of it, Quayle said. Not the cabin, not the wood, not the stove, not the food, not the neighbors. I have the tunnel, Isaac said. Quayle looked at him the way men looked at boys who said things that would get them killed. A tunnel is not a house, he said. A tunnel is a place where men work until they can go home. You sleep in there, the damp takes your blankets in a week. You light a fire without draw. The smoke lays you down before you know you are dying. You block the mouth against snow, and you have sealed yourself inside your own coffin. He pointed toward the shale above the portal. And that lip shed stone every spring thaw. 1 slab across the opening while you are sleeping, and nobody digs you out until June. He put his hand on Isaac's shoulder. The grip was not cruel. It was the grip of a man who had written the names of dead boys into ledgers and did not want to write another. Fine work, Quayle said. Shovel for one of the operating crews. Sleep in a bunkhouse. Eat what they eat. Survive the winter and come back to your paper claim in spring. The crews are full, Isaac said. I asked. Ask again. I asked every foreman on the hill, twice. Quayle let his hand drop. He looked at the portal once more, and Isaac saw him measure it the way he measured every opening, not for what it could become, but for what it could do to whoever went inside. Then God help you, Quayle said, and walked back down the trail toward town. Isaac stood alone at the portal. Inside the tunnel, water dripped at the pace of a slow heartbeat. He took out the thermometer and held it in front of his face. The cracked glass cut off the reading above 60, but the mercury sat visible and steady. Out here, the air was 31 degrees and falling as the afternoon died. He had checked the tunnel that morning. 70 paces inside, the temperature had read 41. At the rear, where the floor rose slightly and the rock was dry, it had read 49. 49 degrees. Not warm, not comfortable, but not killing cold. He put the thermometer back in his coat and looked at the portal. The candle flame inside the lantern did not move. No wind. No wind at all. He did not sleep inside the tunnel that first night. He was afraid, and he had enough honesty left to admit it. Bad air killed men quietly. They felt drowsy, lay down, and never stood up again. Falling stone killed men loudly and did not care whether they were awake. He was 16 and alone, and he had a dead father's watch ticking against his chest, and he was not yet stupid enough or desperate enough to bet his life on a feeling. He slept at the portal instead, wrapped in the mule blanket with his back against the rock face and his legs drawn up. The cold woke him 4 times. Each time he checked the thermometer. 28 degrees at midnight, 26 before dawn. Each time he held the lantern inside the opening and watched the flame. It leaned faintly, not whipping, not guttering, just a slow lean that said air was moving through the tunnel from somewhere he could not see. At first light, he went inside. He walked slowly, marking the left wall every 20 paces with charcoal. The floor was wet for the first 60 feet, then merely damp, then dry where the grade rose. He stopped at each mark and read the thermometer. 31 near the mouth, matching the outside air, 36 at 40 paces, 41 at 60, 45 at 100, 49 at 180 feet. He reached a place where the tunnel widened into a rough chamber. The miners had followed a pocket of quartz that opened and then pinched, and the floor was dry stone with a faint dust of old drill cuttings. The thermometer read 51. He sat on the dry floor and held his hands in front of him. He could not see his breath. He had not been able to stop seeing his breath outside for 3 weeks. The memory arrived without invitation. He was 8 years old, standing in a different tunnel with his father's hand on his shoulder. Rowan had pressed Isaac's palm flat against the rock wall and said, "Feel that." The stone was cold, but it was not winter cold. It did not bite. It held steady the way a cellar floor holds steady, indifferent to the sky, indifferent to the wind, keeping its own temperature the way a sleeping animal keeps its own warmth. "The mountain keeps its own weather," Rowan had said. His thumb was black with ore dust. Lamp smoke drifted past their faces. Somewhere deeper in the tunnel, water ticked into a tin cup someone had left under a drip. Isaac had not understood what that meant when he was 8. He understood it now, sitting on the dry floor of grouse blind number 2 with frost on the ground, outside, and the mercury holding at 51 degrees Fahrenheit, without fire, without stove, without a single cord of wood. The mountain did not follow the sky. The deep rock changed temperature so slowly that winter on the surface barely touched it. The tunnel was not warm, but it was stable, constant. It did not drop to killing cold when the wind blew, did not plunge to 20 below when the January night stretched long. It sat at roughly 50 degrees and stayed there while the cabins above burned through cord after cord of wood, just to keep their insides above freezing. The question was not whether the tunnel was warm enough to survive in. 50 degrees would not kill him. The question was everything else. Could he keep the air safe? Could he stop the damp from rotting his blankets and food? Could he block the portal against snow and wind without sealing himself inside? Could he build a fire small enough to heat the space without poisoning it? Could he do all of this alone with $12 in less than 5 weeks? He stood and walked back toward the portal. At the mouth, he crouched and held the lantern flame in front of the opening. The flame leaned inward. Air was being drawn into the tunnel. Somewhere in the rock, a crack, a fissure, a second opening he had not found. The mountain was breathing. He did not know yet whether that breath would save him or kill him. But the air moved, the temperature held, and every cabin in Animus Forks would need 4 to 6 cords of wood and a working stove and a roof that could hold 10 feet of snow, while Isaac's ceiling was 200 feet of solid granite that had been holding weight since before anything with lungs had walked the earth. He sat at the portal and began to draw in the dirt with a stick, a sleeping platform at the rear, raised off the floor. A drainage trench along one wall. A stone wall, not at the mouth, where snow would push against it, but set back 8 feet inside, where the rock protected it. A small door. Vent holes. A tiny stove with a pipe angled through the stone wall. The design was not genius. It was logic applied to desperation. Every piece existed to solve a specific problem. The platform solved the damp. The trench solved the water. The setback wall solved the snow load. The small door solved the wind. The vents solved the air. And the tiny stove solved the margin between 50 degrees and something a boy could actually live in. He counted his resources. $12.30. A hand auger. 2 chisels. A short-handled shovel. Scrap wood from the waste dump at the Vermilion mine, if the foreman would let him pick through it. Stones. There were stones everywhere, waste rock piled beside every portal on the hill. He did not need lumber for walls. He needed stone, and the mountains were made of it. 5 weeks until winter made the work impossible. He folded the stick drawing into a shape in his mind and started counting stones. Rafe Bell found him 3 days later, sorting waste rock into piles by size. Rafe was 18, a teamster's son who drove ore wagons in summer and shoveled snow off roofs in winter. He was broad across the shoulders and quick to laugh, and he liked Isaac in the way older boys sometimes liked younger ones who did not ask for help and did not complain. They had shared tobacco once behind the mule barn, and Rafe had shown Isaac how to tie a diamond hitch on a pack saddle, and that was the full extent of their friendship. Rafe climbed the trail to the portal and stood watching Isaac stack flat stones against the tunnel wall. Isaac's hands were already cut in 3 places from the sharp granite edges. His fingernails were black. "What are you doing?" Rafe asked. "Sorting." "Sorting for what?" "A wall." Rafe looked at the portal, then at the sorted stones, then at Isaac. "A wall inside the tunnel?" 8 feet inside, dry stacked with a door. Rafe was quiet for a moment. He walked to the portal and looked in. The darkness stared back. Water dripped somewhere inside, faint and steady. "Isaac," he said, "this is a mine. It is a hole in rock that stays 50 degrees when the air outside drops to 0. It is wet. At the front, the back is dry. It is dark. A candle fixes that. It will kill you." Rafe turned around. His face had the look of someone trying to be gentle with news that was not gentle. The damp ruins blankets in a week. Smoke with no chimney lays a man flat. If snow blocks that mouth while you're sleeping, you suffocate before morning, and even if none of that happens, he paused. No girl in this camp will speak to a boy who lives in a mine. Isaac set down the stone he was holding. It weighed maybe 30 pounds, and it had taken him 10 minutes to carry it from the waste pile. "I do not need the tunnel to be comfortable," he said. "I need it not to freeze." "You will freeze anyway. 50 degrees with wet air and no proper bed. That is not survival. That is a slow death that feels like sleep." "Slower than no shelter at all?" Rafe had no answer for that. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the sorted stones and the charcoal marks on the tunnel wall and the boy with the bleeding hands who had no other plan. "You are building yourself a grave," Rafe said. But he said it quietly, and he did not leave. Victor Maud heard about the stone piles on the 4th day. He came up the trail in the late afternoon, wearing a town coat and leather gloves that had never touched ore. 2 men from the store walked behind him, not enforcers, just witnesses. Maud liked witnesses. They made his words sound official. Isaac was inside the portal when he heard boots on the gravel. He came out with the shovel in one hand and found Maud standing 10 feet from the opening, studying the sorted stones the way a man studies a neighbor's fence that has been built 1 inch onto his property. "I hear you mean to live in here," Maud said. I mean to survive the winter. In a mine. In the only property I own. The one you gave me. Maud's jaw worked. The words landed exactly where Isaac aimed them, and both of them knew it. The deed had been Maud's idea, his way of making Isaac disappear from the town's books without the inconvenience of actually helping him. If Isaac now used the property to survive, then the gift was not mercy. It was attempted disposal that had backfired. No pauper boy keeps a town claim because he likes playing badger, Maud said. The deed has my name on it. A name on paper will not hold a roof up. Maud looked at the portal. You will be dead by December, and the town will have to deal with the body. That is what you are building here, a problem for other people to clean up. Then you will not mind if I die on my own property, Isaac said. It will save you the trouble of watching. Maud's face changed. Isaac saw the calculation behind the man's eyes. Not anger, but something colder. Maud wanted this portal, not for Isaac's reasons, not for shelter, but because the adit entrance sat near a path that might one day become a road cut, or because the tunnel itself might serve as freight storage, or because a speculative claim on even barren rock carried value in a camp where claims changed hands like playing cards. Maud had pushed the deed transfer expecting Isaac to abandon it. Isaac was not abandoning it. I will give you $15 for the deed, Maud said. That is more than it is worth, and more than you will earn this winter. $15. It would buy food for a month if Isaac ate little, a cot at the boarding house for 3 weeks, then nothing. $15 bought time, not survival. The tunnel could buy a winter. No, Isaac said. Maud smiled the way men smile when they have been refused something they intend to take anyway. I will remember that, Maud said. He turned and walked back down the trail, his witnesses following in a line like ducklings. Isaac stood at the portal and watched them go. His hands were shaking, but not from cold. He turned back to the sorted stones. The largest flat piece he had found so far was 2 feet across and 8 inches thick. It was the size of a door slab, and it weighed more than he could lift alone. He sat down beside it and pressed his palms against his knees until the shaking stopped. Then he picked up the shovel and went back inside the tunnel. Behind him, the afternoon light was failing. The sleet had turned to snow. The work became its own kind of clock. Each day was measured not in hours, but in stones carried, in feet of trench scratched into the tunnel floor, in charcoal marks on the wall showing where the bulkhead would rise. Week 1. Isaac cleared 12 wheelbarrow loads of loose rock from the first 40 feet of tunnel. He had no wheelbarrow. Why, he used a canvas sack dragged on a plank. The loose rock had to go because it held water, and water was the enemy he understood best. His mother had died of pneumonia that started in a rented room where frost grew on the inside of the window glass. Damp air in enclosed spaces did not wait for winter to kill. It worked quietly, through coughs that deepened and fevers that lingered and lungs that filled with fluid while the body slept. His hands blistered on the 2nd day. The blisters broke on the 3rd. By the 5th day, the raw skin had begun to harden into the kind of calluses that miners' sons grew early and kept for life. He ate once a day, flour mixed with creek water and cooked on a flat stone over a tiny fire built just outside the portal, beans soaked overnight in a tin cup, coffee when he could afford it, which was not often. His food supply was shrinking faster than he wanted to count, so he stopped counting and kept working. The drainage trench was the first real test. Jory Travaskis had not yet appeared, and Isaac was working from memory and instinct, his father's habits absorbed over years of watching without being taught. He scratched a shallow channel along the left wall of the tunnel, angling it toward the portal so water would flow outward. The angle had to be just enough to move water, not so steep that it became a stream during heavy rain or snowmelt. He used the hand auger to test depth and the chisels to widen the channel where the rock pinched. The trench reached 20 feet before the first mistake revealed itself. He had angled the first section too flat. Water pooled at the 12-foot mark instead of flowing, and within 2 days the standing water had begun to seep sideways into the floor where Isaac planned to stack the bulkhead's foundation stones. Wet foundation meant shifting stones. Shifting stones meant a wall that would lean, then buckle, then fall. He had to recut the first 12 feet of trench. 2 days of work destroyed and redone. The correction cost him 3 days he did not have to spare. The weather was not waiting. Mornings came colder each week. Ice formed on the creek by the second week of October. The aspens had already dropped their leaves, and the bare branches clicked against each other in the wind like bones counting something down. The freight teams made fewer runs. Men who had been casual about winter preparations began working with the grim focus of people who could feel the season tightening around them. At Maud's store, someone told the story of the boy building a wall inside a dead mine, and the men laughed. One miner left a broken coffin handle at the portal. Children from the lower camp dared each other to run inside and shout, and their voices echoed off the wet rock like small ghosts practicing. Someone, Isaac never learned who, painted a white cross on the first stone he had stacked for the bulkhead base. He found the cross in the morning, white lime paint on gray granite. He looked at it for a long time. Then he pulled the stone from the pile, turned it around so the painted face looked inward, and set it back into the wall. The cross would be part of the structure now, invisible, carried. Maud escalated on the same day. He filed a complaint with the town's informal council that Isaac was creating a public hazard by occupying an uninspected mine opening. The complaint had just enough technical language to sound official. Unventilated horizontal excavation, risk of structural failure, possible danger to passers-by from loose stone above the portal. The complaint required Amos Quayle to inspect again. Quayle arrived in the late afternoon with a lantern and a sour expression. He walked the tunnel for the second time, noted the drainage trench, noted the sorted stones, noted the charcoal temperature markings on the wall. He came back out and stood facing Isaac with his arms crossed. "The trench is on the correct side," Quayle said. "I will give you that." And you still have no cribbing, no door, no stove, no ventilation plan, and winter is 4 weeks away." He paused. "But I cannot call this a public hazard when nobody lives within 100 paces and the only person who goes inside is you." He wrote his finding on a scrap of paper. "No immediate public hazard identified. Occupant assumes all risk," and handed it to Isaac. "You are still gonna die in there," Quayle said, "but it will be your own doing, and I will not have Maud using my name to take your paper away." He left. Isaac folded the inspection note and put it inside his coat beside the deed. 2 pieces of paper. One said he owned a hole in the ground. The other said the hole would not kill anyone except him. He went back to sorting stones. The bulkhead base needed to be 3 feet wide at the bottom to support a wall that would rise 7 feet to the tunnel ceiling. He needed flat stones for the faces and angular rubble to pack between them. He needed long stones that would reach through the full thickness of the wall, tying the front face to the back, like stitches holding a wound closed. He did not yet know the word for what he needed. He would learn it from a limping Cornishman who had not yet walked up the trail. The first snow that would not melt fell on the 23rd of October. Isaac watched it from the portal as the light died. The flakes were small and hard, not the wet, heavy ones that melted on contact. These were the dry crystals that meant cold had come to stay. They landed on the sorted stones and did not disappear. They landed on his shoulders and stayed. 4 weeks of work done. The trench reached 40 feet. The stone piles were sorted and ready. The bulkhead had a foundation line chalked on the tunnel floor, but not a single course had been laid. He had flour for perhaps 10 days. Beans for a week after that. His $12 had become $8 after buying lamp oil and a second-hand tin bucket that did not leak. $8 against 4 months of winter. The math had been impossible from the beginning. It was becoming worse. He sat at the portal in the gathering dark with the mule blanket around his shoulders and the snow falling into his hair. Behind him, the tunnel breathed its slow, invisible breath. Somewhere in the rock, air moved through cracks he could not see, following paths he did not understand, drawn by pressure differences that his father's cracked thermometer could measure but not explain. The flame of his candle lantern leaned gently toward the dark interior. Steady, patient, alive. He had laid no stones yet. He had built no wall, hung no door, set no stove. He had a trench, a chalk line, and a theory that the mountain might save him if he could learn to listen to it. And somewhere on the road below, though Isaac did not know it yet, a man with a crushed hip and 30 years of Cornish stonework in his hands was watching smoke rise from the upper trail and thinking about the kind of boy who builds in rock instead of running from it. Jory Travaskis came up the trail on the last day of October, and the first thing he did was try to destroy Isaac's work. Isaac had started the bulkhead. He had no teacher, no plan beyond the chalk line, and no experience building anything from stone. He stacked what made sense to him, large flat stones on the outer face, arranged as neatly as he could manage, with rubble shoved into the gap behind them. The wall rose 18 inches in 2 days. It looked solid. It looked like what he imagined a wall should look like. Clean, orderly even. Jory stood on the trail for 10 minutes watching before Isaac noticed him. He was 56 years old, Cornish, with a face like crumpled leather, and a hip that had been crushed 6 years earlier when a stope ceiling dropped a slab the size of a table onto his left side. He walked with a rolling limp that made him look like a man perpetually stepping off a boat. His hands were enormous, wide across the palm, thick in the fingers, scarred white along the knuckles from decades of cutting and setting stone in Cornish tin mines and Colorado silver tunnels. He watched Isaac place a flat stone on the top course, tap it level with the heel of his palm, and step back to check the line. Then Jory walked to the wall and kicked the bottom course. The kick was not gentle. His boot struck the base stone hard enough to shift it a 1/4 inch. The stone above it tilted. The stone above that tilted the other direction. The rubble behind the face stones, which Isaac had packed loosely, began to slide. A cascade of small rocks rattled onto the tunnel floor, and the top 3 courses of Isaac's beautiful, orderly wall leaned outward like a drunk man losing his balance. Isaac grabbed the shovel and raised it. Jory did not step back. He looked at the shovel, then at Isaac, then at the leaning wall. "Good," Jory said. "Be angry now, not when 10 feet of snow leans on it." Isaac held the shovel for 3 seconds. Then he lowered it. "Who are you?" Isaac asked. "Jory Travaskis. I timbered the Dorado stope for 6 years and walled shaft collars in Redruth before I could grow a beard." He pointed at the leaning wall. "That is a pretty face with nothing behind it. You stacked flat stones like shelves and packed the rear with gravel. The face looks strong. The core is loose. First hard push, snow load, frost heave, a mule leaning against it, and the whole thing opens like a book. Then how do you build it? Jory looked at him for a long time. Isaac saw the old man measuring something that had nothing to do with stone, measuring whether the boy who raised the shovel was the kind who swung or the kind who listened. I saw your drainage trench from the road, Jory said. It is on the correct side. You recut the first section when the grade went wrong. That tells me you pay attention to water. He paused. It also tells me nobody taught you. You are working from watching, not from knowing. My father was a tram hand. He knew tunnels, not walls. Your father was Rowan Vale. Isaac nodded. I knew him, Jory said. He had steady hands and he did not take shortcuts with brake sets. He paused. I heard about the tram. Silence in the tunnel. Water dripped. I will not build your wall for you, Jory said. But I will show you why that one fell, and you will build the next one so it does not. The trade was not charity. Jory made that clear within the first hour. He needed help carrying his own winter coal from the supply wagon to his cabin. His hip made the work agony, and he had no sons. He needed a goat shed mended before the snow buried it. He needed someone to climb a ladder and reseat a stovepipe joint he could no longer reach. Isaac would do these things. Jory would teach him stone. They started that afternoon by tearing down everything Isaac had built. The first lesson was the hardest because it required Isaac to unlearn what his eyes told him. A wall is not a face, Jory said. He sat on a flat boulder near the portal, his bad hips stretched out, and held two stones, one flat and smooth, one angular and ugly. A face is what you see. A wall is what holds. These are not the same thing. He made Isaac stack 3 courses the correct way. The wall had to batter inward, lean back slightly so that gravity pressed it together instead of pulling it apart. Every third course needed a through stone, a long piece that reached from the front face all the way to the back, tying the wall together the way a bone ties muscle to muscle. Between the face stones, the core had to be packed with harding, small angular pieces wedged tightly, not dumped loosely, so that the interior was as solid as the surface. Vertical joints must never run, Jory said. Every joint on one course must be covered by stone on the course above. A running joint is a hinge. A hinge is a failure. Isaac rebuilt the first 3 courses 4 times before Jory stopped correcting him. His hands bled in new places. The work was slower than before. Each stone had to be tested, turned, sometimes chiseled to fit. But when Jory kicked the base of the new wall, nothing moved. The second lesson came 2 days later, inside the tunnel. Jory taught Isaac to read rock. Tap with the hammer, Jory said. He rapped his knuckles against the tunnel ceiling. Listen, solid rock sounds like a bell. A crack sounds like a pot. Loose rock sounds like a boot on a plank. Isaac tapped. Most of the tunnel ceiling rang clean, but at the portal, where the shale hung in flakes above the mouth, the sound was flat and hollow. That sheds, Jory said. Every freeze-thaw cycle, water gets in the cracks, freezes, expands, and pushes. Come spring, slabs drop. He chalked a line on the ceiling. Never sleep under fresh cracks. Never put your door directly beneath that lip. Set the bulkhead back where the sound changes. Isaac tapped along the ceiling until he found the transition. 6 feet inside the portal, the stone rang solid. He moved his chalk line for the bulkhead back to 8 feet inside, where good rock arched overhead. The third lesson was ventilation, and it nearly killed the lesson. Jory had Isaac build a small fire in the rear chamber using scrap-lagging wood. The smoke rose, hit the ceiling, and spread into a flat gray layer that thickened as they watched. Within 3 minutes, Isaac's eyes burned. Within 5, he was coughing. Kill it, Jory said. Isaac smothered the fire with dirt. They retreated to the portal and stood in the cold air, breathing hard. Warm smoke rises, Jory said, but it only rises if it has somewhere to go. Seal a tunnel and light a fire, and the smoke fills from the ceiling down. It reaches your face while you sleep. You breathe it. You do not wake up. The solution required 2 openings, a low intake slot near the bottom of the bulkhead wall, which would draw cold air inward along the floor, and a stovepipe channel angled upward through the wall, which would carry warm smoke outward. The intake slot had to be shielded from the outside with a stone baffle, so drifting snow could not pack into it. The pipe had to angle upward so the natural draw of warm air would pull smoke through even without wind. Test with lamp smoke before sleeping, Jory said. Hold the lamp near the intake. If the flame leans inward, the draw is alive. If the flame stands still, something is blocked. If the flame leans outward, the air is coming in through the pipe and going out through the slot, reversed. Reverse draw pushes smoke into the chamber. Reverse draw kills. Isaac scratched the vent design into the tunnel wall with charcoal. 2 holes, one low, one high. The difference between breathing and dying. The 4th lesson was water. Jory walked the full length of the tunnel, touching the walls, pressing his palm to the floor, studying the seep patterns. Damp is an enemy as real as cold, Jory said. It does not kill fast. It kills by rotting what keeps you alive. Damp blankets lose their warmth. Damp flour grows mold. Damp clothes against skin pull heat out of a body faster than dry, cold air. You trench the floor, you raise the bed, and you keep food in sealed tins. Anything that touches whetstone is already ruined. Isaac's sleeping platform had to be raised at least 8 inches off the floor on stone piers, with lagging boards laid across them. The boards had to be scavenged. Isaac had no money for lumber, and every board had to be dry before it went inside. Wet wood brought its own damp and defeated the purpose. The 5th lesson was snow defense, and Jory taught it by telling Isaac a story about a man who froze to death behind a door he could not open. Cabin door opens outward, Jory said. Storm drops 6 feet of snow against the wall. Man pushes the door. Door does not move. Snow is heavier than the man. He has no second exit. He freezes 3 feet from the outside air. The solution for the tunnel was a short snow trench, a narrow passage built outward from the bulkhead door, walled with stacked stone on both sides and roofed with flat slabs. The trench was 4 feet long and 3 feet wide. If snow buried the portal, Isaac could clear the short trench from inside, pushing snow out with the shovel instead of trying to open a door against the weight of the entire drift. Build the door small, Jory said. A big door is pride. A small door is survival. 3 feet by 4 feet. That was the door. Small enough to block quickly, small enough to clear from inside, too small for snow pressure to overwhelm. November arrived and the work became a race that Isaac could feel in his bones. Progress came in measurable increments that he tracked on the tunnel wall beside the temperature marks. Week 3, since the first stone, the bulkhead had risen to 3 feet. It was not fast enough. The wall needed to reach the ceiling, roughly 5.5 feet at the point Isaac had chosen, and every course took longer than the one below because the stones had to be lifted higher and fitted more carefully as the arch of the tunnel narrowed the space. His food supply had dwindled to flour, beans, coffee, and 2 strips of bacon he was saving for the day the work was done or the day he could not work anymore, whichever came first. $8 had become $5 after buying more lamp oil and a second-hand stove, a small sheet iron box the size of a bread loaf with a broken leg that Jory helped him brace with a stone wedge. The stove had cost $2. The 6 feet of pipe to go with it had cost $1. The pipe was dented and would need careful angling to draw properly. A cold rain came on the 5th of November and filled the drainage trench to its banks. Water overtopped the channel at the 12-foot mark, the same spot where Isaac had recut the grade weeks earlier and spread across the floor where the bulkhead's foundation stones sat. Isaac spent a full day bailing with the tin bucket, then recutting the trench deeper while standing in 2 inches of ice water. His boots did not dry for 3 days. His feet turned white and soft, and Jory told him to rub them with bacon grease and keep them out of the wet, or he would lose toes. The stovepipe backdrafted on its first test. Isaac lit a small fire in the stove, and smoke poured back through the pipe into the chamber instead of drawing outward. He killed the fire immediately. Jory's lesson fixed in his mind like a brand, and spent 2 hours adjusting the pipe angle before the draw reversed and smoke began pulling through the wall the way it was supposed to. The ceiling above the stove was blackened in a circle 3 feet wide. Isaac scraped the soot off with the shovel blade because Jory told him soot buildup near a hot pipe could ignite. A slab fell from the portal lip during a midday thaw. Isaac heard it coming, a grinding sound like a boot twisting on gravel, magnified through the rock. He was inside the tunnel when the slab dropped. It was not large, perhaps 2 feet across, 4 inches thick, but it struck the ground at the portal mouth with a sound like a gunshot and shattered into fragments that skittered across the floor. If Isaac had been standing at the entrance, it would have hit his shoulder and head. He walked to the portal and looked up. The shale above the mouth had a fresh scar where the slab had separated. More flakes hung above it, waiting for the next thaw and freeze cycle to pry them loose. Jory's chalk line on the ceiling seemed wiser now than it had when he drew it. The bulkhead, set back 8 feet inside good rock, would not be touched by anything that fell from the lip. The portal was the weak point. Everything beyond the bulkhead was the stronghold. Maud sent boys to scatter Isaac's sorted stone piles. Isaac came back from Jory's cabin one afternoon to find the flat-stacking stones kicked off their ledge and mixed into the rubble pile. 3 hours of sorting destroyed. He resorted in silence while the boys watched from below, laughing. Rafe reappeared on the 12th of November. He came after dark with his father's mule and said nothing about where he had been for 3 days. He tied the mule to a stump and helped Isaac haul 14 heavy stones from the waste dump to the portal in 2 hours. Work that would have taken Isaac 3 days alone. "My father cannot know," Rafe said. "Your father will know. He will count the mule's steps. Then he will be angry tomorrow. Tonight we haul." They hauled until the mule planted its hooves and refused to climb the trail again. Rafe untied the animal and led it back down the hill without saying goodbye. The bulkhead reached 5 feet by the 15th of November. The arch of the tunnel ceiling began to close above it, and Isaac had to shape the final courses to match the curve, chiseling stones with angles that would wedge against the rock and lock the wall into the mountain itself. Jory supervised, sitting on a stone near the portal with his coat pulled tight and his breath visible in the lamplight. "The wall does not hold itself," Jory said. "The mountain holds it. Your job is to make the wall part of the mountain." Isaac pressed the final keystone into the arch. The wall was solid. He stepped back and pushed against it with both hands. It did not flex. He struck it with the heel of his palm. The sound was solid, dense, the sound of something that had committed to staying where it was. The door opening was 3 feet wide and 4 feet high, framed by the thickest stones Isaac had found. The door itself was a slab of lagging board backed with 2 layers of canvas, hung on rawhide hinges and secured with an iron strap scavenged from a broken ore bucket. It was not pretty. It was not the kind of door a person would build if they had choices. but it swung and it sealed, and when Isaac closed it, the wind that moaned at the portal died to silence inside the chamber. Amos Quayle came for his third inspection on the 16th of November. Maud had demanded it, citing the stovepipe as a fire hazard. Quayle walked the full tunnel with his lantern, checked the drainage trench, studied the bulkhead wall, opened and closed the door, examined the vent slots, and watched Isaac relight the stove. The smoke drew cleanly. The flame leaned inward at the low intake slot. Air moved through the tunnel in a slow, steady circulation, cold in along the floor, warming as it passed the stove, rising and escaping through the pipe channel. Quayle stood in the rear chamber and held his hand over the stove. He looked at the thermometer hanging from a nail on the wall. 48 degrees. He looked at the sleeping platform, raised 8 inches on stone piers, with dry lagging boards and the mule blanket folded on top. He looked at the sealed tin holding Isaac's remaining flour. You seal that mouth wrong, and the first good fire will lay you down quiet. Quayle had told him weeks ago. Isaac had not sealed the mouth wrong. The fire burned clean. The smoke obeyed the pipe. The air moved. Quayle said nothing for a long time. Then, I have seen worse bunkhouses in operating mines. He paused. Do not let that stovepipe rust through. Check the draw every night before you sleep, and keep that intake clear of snow, or you are finished. He left. He did not say the tunnel would save Isaac's life. He did not say Isaac had built well. But he did not say Isaac would die, and that was more than he had ever offered before. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who only saw the outside of what you were building? That night, Jory came to the tunnel for the last inspection before winter locked down the valley. He walked slowly, tapping the ceiling, listening. Isaac followed, holding the lamp. Everything rang clean until they reached the rear chamber. Jory tapped above the sleeping platform, the warmest spot, the place where Isaac had measured 51 degrees in the first week, and stopped. He tapped again. The sound was not a bell. It was not a pot. It was something between a faint dead tone that said the stone was neither solid nor loose, but cracked somewhere inside where eyes could not reach. Hairline, Jory said. He ran his finger along a seam Isaac had never noticed, a dark line in the rock, thinner than a pencil mark, running diagonally across the ceiling above the platform. Might hold 10 years, might shed next thaw. He looked at Isaac. Move the bed. That is the warmest spot. That is the spot where a slab lands on your chest while you sleep. Isaac looked at the hairline crack. He could barely see it. It looked like nothing. It looked like a thread of shadow in the lamplight. How far? He asked. 12 feet at least. Put the platform where the sound rings clean. Isaac measured with his paces. 12 feet deeper brought him to a section of tunnel where the ceiling was slightly lower, but the rock rang solid under Jory's hammer. He read the thermometer. 48 degrees instead of 51. 3 degrees. The difference between the warmest spot and the safest spot. He had learned enough from Jory to know which one mattered. He moved the bed that night. Isaac finished the refuge 2 days before the storm. The completed shelter was not beautiful. It was not the kind of place a man would choose to live if he had any other choice on the mountain. But it was finished, and it worked, and Isaac knew exactly what it could do because he had tested every part of it in the way Jory had taught him, not by hoping, but by measuring. Outside, the water bucket froze solid overnight. Ice formed on the surface before sunset and reached the bottom by morning. Inside, the water pan near the portal grew a skin of ice. but the pan in the rear chamber stayed liquid. The rear chamber held at 48 degrees by the thermometer day and night, regardless of what the sky did. A single armload of wood in the stove raised the chamber temperature to 53 degrees within an hour. When the fire died, the temperature dropped slowly, not the crashing plunge of a cabin losing heat through thin walls and a leaky roof, but a gradual drift that took 4 hours to settle back to 48. The mountain held the warmth the way a stone holds the sun's heat after dark, releasing it slowly, grudgingly, degree by degree. The bulkhead stopped the wind. Outside the wall, the air at the portal entrance moaned and gusted and drove sleet horizontally across the opening. Inside the wall, the air was still. The low intake slot drew cold air inward along the floor in a current Isaac could feel on his ankles, but not on his face. The stovepipe drew smoke outward with a steady pull that made the flame in the stove lean toward the pipe. Amos Quayle came once more. He stood in the rear chamber with his arms folded and looked at the thermometer, the stove, the sleeping platform, the sealed food tins, the drainage trench, the cleared vent slots. "You have made a tolerable cellar," he said. "Not a home." Isaac did not argue. Quayle was right in every way except the one that mattered. It was not a home. It was a place where a boy would not freeze to death, and in Animas Forks in November of 1884, that distinction was the only one that counted. Rafe visited and marveled at the wall. He knocked on it with his fist and grinned when it did not move. But his eyes kept going to the portal, to the darkness beyond the lamplight, to the low ceiling and the wet floor near the entrance. "I would go mad in here," Rafe said. "You would be alive in here." Same thing some days. Nora Pell came to the portal that evening with news she carried from the telegraph office in Silverton. She was 17, lean-faced, with ink on her fingers from copying messages. She had walked 11 miles in the cold because the news was the kind that traveled on foot when the wire was down. A deep storm system had stalled west of the range. The barometric readings at the Silverton station had been falling for 2 days. Freight teams on the Stony Pass Road had turned back. The upper valley was about to be sealed. Isaac thanked her. She looked past him into the tunnel, saw the bulkhead wall and the faint glow of the stove through the door opening, and said nothing. She turned and walked back down the trail toward the lower camp. That night, the signs appeared in sequence, the way old miners said they always did. Pressure built in the ears like a hand pressing. Snow began as hard pellets, not flakes. Ice crystals so small they sounded like sand on the rock face. The mules in the lower camp refused the upper trail. Spruce branches drooped under wet accumulation that had not been there at noon. Jory coughed blood into a rag. He did it quietly, sitting on his porch, while Isaac helped stack the last of his coal against the cabin wall. Isaac saw the rag come away dark. Jory saw him see it. Neither spoke. Jory's lungs had 30 years of mine dust and damp air packed into them. The Cornish called it miner's rot, the slow stiffening and scarring that turned strong men into wheezing shadows by 50. Jory was 56, and his breathing had the sound of paper tearing at the edges. "Keep the door small," Jory said. "Shovel from inside before you open outward. Clear the intake first, the pipe second. If you must choose between warmth and air, choose air. You can survive cold. You cannot survive an empty room." He looked at the sky. The clouds were the color of iron, and they sat so low that the upper ridges had vanished. "A big door is pride," Jory said. "A small door is survival." Isaac went back to the tunnel. He closed the door behind him, lit the stove, and lay on the platform listening to the mountain make no sound at all. Outside, the first roof in Animas Forks began to groan. The storm began as snow. That was the gentle part. By the end of the first day, 6 inches covered the ground, and the wind had not yet started. Men walked between buildings, stamping their boots and saying this was nothing. October storms dropped more than this and melted by noon. They were right about October. They were wrong about what was coming. On the second day, the snow turned wet. Heavy, dense flakes that fell straight down in windless air and packed on every horizontal surface with the weight of sodden cloth. Roofs that shed dry snow easily now held the wet weight like sponges. Porches creaked. The church vestry door stuck in its frame. Men shoveled roofs for the first time, and the snow they threw off was so heavy that the shovelers rested every 10 throws. On the third day, the temperature dropped and the wet snow froze into a crust. New snow fell on top of the crust, dry now, wind-driven, and the layered weight began to compress. Cabin roofs that could shed 3 feet of dry powder could not shed 1 foot of frozen crust under 2 feet of fresh drift. Shoveling twice a day became necessary. The men who had laughed at the weather on day 1 were not laughing. Isaac checked his systems every 4 hours. Intake slot clear, pipe drawing, stove running on a single split log per hour. Temperature in the rear chamber holding at 47 degrees Celsius, 1 degree below the pre-storm reading, accounted for by the colder air entering through the intake. He ate beans and flour and drank water from the pan that would not freeze. On the 5th day, the paths between buildings disappeared. Snow drifted against walls and buried first-floor windows on the leeward side. Men dug trenches to reach their woodpiles and watched the trenches fill behind them as they walked back to their doors. The drift against the south side of Maud's store rose above the porch rail. On the 7th day, the first porch roof collapsed. The Sutter cabin, built the previous spring with green timber that had warped and split by autumn, lost its porch under the accumulated weight. The sound carried across the camp like a tree falling. Mrs. Sutter screamed. Her husband was already outside shoveling and had to dig back to his own door to reach her. By the 9th day, the drifts around Isaac's portal had reached the top of the snow trench. The stone-walled passage that Jory had designed was holding. Snow sat on the flat roof slabs and pressed against the side walls, but could not collapse inward because the walls were battered and the stones were locked. Isaac cleared the trench from inside every 6 hours, pushing snow outward with the shovel in a crouch that left his back aching and his shoulders scraped raw against the stone walls. The town began calling the storm the Great Weight. Not because the snow was the deepest anyone had seen, but because the layering, wet, frozen, dry, wet again, frozen again, created a load that conventional roofs could not carry. Shoveling no longer solved the problem because shovelers could not clear fast enough. Isaac woke on the 10th morning to silence, not the silence of a quiet night, the silence of a world that had been covered. The stove had gone out. He had slept through the last logs burning. He lay on the platform in absolute darkness and felt the air. 42 degrees by the skin on his face, maybe 41. Cold, but not killing cold. The mountain was holding. He relit the stove by feel. The match flared, and the small chamber appeared around him, stone walls, dry ceiling, the thermometer hanging steady at 43 degrees. He checked the intake by holding the match near the slot. The flame leaned inward. Air was moving. He was breathing. The pipe was a different story. He opened the stove door and held the match inside. Smoke rose, hit the pipe, and stopped. It did not draw. It began to curl back into the chamber. Isaac killed the match and closed the stove door. He sat in the dark and thought. The pipe was blocked. Snow had covered the outer end. Without draw, smoke would fill the chamber. Without the stove, the temperature would drop, slowly because the mountain held, but steadily, degree by degree, until 43 became 35, became 30, became the kind of cold that killed a sleeping boy. He needed to clear the pipe from outside. That meant opening the door, clearing the snow trench, and reaching the pipe's exit point above the bulkhead. But the pipe exit was 7 feet up the face of the wall, and if the snow had reached it, the snow outside was deep enough to bury the entire bulkhead face. He could not dig that much snow from inside a 3-foot wide trench. Jory's hooked rod. Isaac had made it the week before. A long scrap of iron pipe with a bent nail wired to the end, designed to reach through the stovepipe channel from inside the wall and push obstructions clear. He had thought it was unnecessary. He had made it because Jory told him to. He found the rod by feel, fed it into the stovepipe channel, and pushed. Resistance. He pushed harder. Something gave. Cold air rushed back through the pipe with a sound like a gasp, and when he relit the stove and opened the door, the smoke leaned toward the pipe and drew clean. He sat on the platform with his hands shaking and listened to the stove tick as the iron heated. Jory's rod had saved him the way Jory's lessons always saved him. Not with brilliance, but with the quiet foresight of a man who had spent 30 years learning what goes wrong underground. Outside the snow trench, something was happening that Isaac could hear but not see. Sounds traveled strangely through packed snow, groaning wood, distant shouts, the crack of a timber giving way. He cleared the trench enough to see past the outer mouth and saw only white. The world had been simplified to 2 colors, white snow and gray sky, with the dark rectangle of his tunnel mouth the only mark of human existence on the entire hillside. On the 11th day, Rafe came. He appeared at the outer end of the snow trench like a man crawling out of his own grave, hatless, snow-crusted, his face red and raw from wind and ice. He had dug a tunnel from his family's cabin 40 yards downhill, following the buried trail by memory, and he was breathing so hard that the air around his head turned to steam. "Millie," he said. That was all. Just the name. Rafe's younger sister was 12. Their cabin roof had cracked on the 9th night, not collapsed entirely, but split along the ridge beam so that snow fell through the gap onto the beds below. Millie had been sleeping when wet snow landed on her chest and face. She breathed it in, half awake, coughing. By morning, she was feverish. By the 11th day, the fever had climbed to the point where she could not keep water down, and her breathing sounded like a bellows with a hole in it. The cabin was wet. Snow kept sifting through the cracked ridge. The stove burned constantly, but could not keep ahead of the cold air pouring through the gap. The Bell family was burning their last cord, and the cabin was still barely above freezing. "Bring her," Isaac said. Rafe stared at him. "She cannot walk. Carry her. Wrap her in everything dry you have. Come through the trench." Rafe left. Isaac stood in the tunnel and looked at his shelter, the platform that held 1 person, the food supply that would last 1 person through the winter, the air balance calculated for 1 stove and 1 set of lungs. Every person he let inside would change the math. More breath meant more moisture, more carbon in the air. More bodies meant faster food depletion. More movement meant more heat loss through the open door. He could say no. He could seal the door and survive alone, and listen to the storm take whatever it would take, and emerge in spring with his life and his calculations intact. He started clearing the platform to make room. Rafe came back carrying Millie wrapped in a quilt that was already damp. Behind him came his mother, his father, and his father's hired man, each carrying what they could: food, blankets, a tin of lamp oil. 5 people. Isaac's shelter had been built for 1. He put Millie on the platform nearest the stove. He put Mrs. Bell beside her. He told the men to sit along the wall near the middle of the tunnel, where the temperature was 45 degrees and else, not as warm as the rear chamber, but dry and out of the wind. He was calculating air when the pounding started. It came from outside the snow trench. Not Rafe. Rafe was inside. Not the Bells. They were all accounted for. Someone else was on the other side of the packed snow, hammering on what might have been the bulkhead wall or might have been the snow trench roof. "Who is that?" Rafe asked. Isaac listened. The pounding was not frantic. It was rhythmic, measured. The pounding of a man who conserved his energy because he knew how much he had left. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next changes everything. Isaac cleared the snow trench and found Amos Quayle on his hands and knees in the drift, holding the arm of a woman Isaac did not recognize. Quayle's left ear was black with frostbite. He was breathing in sharp, shallow gasps, and his right arm was pressed against his ribs in the way of a man holding something broken together. "The town hall roof," Quayle said. "Partial collapse, north wall." Behind Quayle, a second figure materialized in the snow, then a third. The town hall had sheltered 8 people when the north roof section failed under the layered ice. The ceiling dropped in one piece, like a trapdoor closing. Quayle had pulled 2 people clear before his rib broke. The others had fled into the storm. Some had reached neighbors' cabins. Some had not. Isaac looked at the people gathered in his tunnel. 5 Bells. Quayle. 2 from the town hall. 8 people, and his rear chamber was 30 feet long and 6 feet wide. He made the decisions the way Jory had taught him to make decisions underground, not by what felt right, but by what the numbers allowed. Millie stayed on the platform, closest to the stove, because fever killed faster than cold, and the child needed the warmth most. The injured went near the middle chamber, where they could lie flat without blocking the airflow path between the intake and the pipe. Those who could sit went along the walls of the rear chamber, spaced so their body heat supplemented the stove without their breath overwhelming the ventilation. The door stayed small. 1 person through at a time, opened only when necessary, closed immediately behind. He was explaining the vent system to Quayle when Victor Maud arrived. Maud had not dug his own tunnel. He had followed the tracks that Quayle's group had broken through the snow. He appeared at the outer end of the trench with his town coat buttoned to the throat and his leather gloves soaked through, and he pushed past the stone entrance without waiting for Isaac to open the door. "Open it wider," Maud said. "I cannot fit through this." "The door stays as it is," Isaac said. "I am a councilman. The door is 3 feet by 4 feet, because a bigger door loses heat faster than the stove can make it. You go through sideways, or you do not go through at all." Maud's face worked. He was cold, frightened, and standing in the entrance of a shelter built by a boy he had tried to make disappear. Behind him, the storm screamed across the portal like something alive. "You will let me in?" Maud said. "I will let you in when you bring the town's stored lamp oil and the flour from your storeroom, for common use, not for sale." Maud stared. "There are 12 people inside this tunnel," Isaac said. "My food feeds 1. Yours feeds a town. Bring it, and you're welcome. Come empty, and you sit in the snow." Maud left. He came back 40 minutes later with 2 tins of lamp oil and a 20-pound sack of flour carried by the hired man who had followed him. He said nothing as he turned sideways and pushed through the small door, scraping his coat buttons against the stone. Isaac sealed the door behind him. The hours that followed were the longest of Isaac's life. 12 people in a space designed for 1. The rear chamber temperature dropped from 48 to 44 as body heat and breath changed the air balance. It stabilized there. The stove consumed one small split log every hour. Isaac timed it by his father's watch, feeding the fire at intervals that kept the iron warm without overwhelming the draw. The smoke pulled clean through the pipe. The intake slot drew cold air along the floor. The air in the chamber was close but breathable. Millie's fever broke on the second night. Mrs. Bell held a damp cloth to the girl's forehead and felt the heat recede like a tide going out. The child opened her eyes and said she was thirsty, and Mrs. Bell cried into the quilt while Rafe stood with his back to the wall and his jaw locked and his eyes fixed on Isaac, who was checking the intake slot with the lamp. The water barrel did not freeze. The flour stayed dry in its sealed tin. The stove, a bread loaf-sized box of dented sheet iron that had cost $2, performed exactly as Jory had taught Isaac to run it. Small fire, steady feed, never roaring, never starved. Outside, the cabins groaned and cracked and buried themselves. Inside, the mountain held. 200 feet of granite above the ceiling carried the storm's weight, without flexing, without groaning, without asking to be shoveled. The snow pressed down on the world, and the world bent under it, except in the one place where the world was made of stone. Maud sat against the wall near the bulkhead and stared at the stones. His eyes moved across the dry stacked courses, the through stones, the tight harding, the battered face that leaned inward. His eyes found the white cross, the paint mark someone had left as a joke, the stone Isaac had turned inward and built into the wall. He stared at the cross for a long time. Isaac did not notice. He was crouched at the intake slot with the hooked rod, clearing a crust of ice that had formed on the outer baffle. Cold air rushed in when the ice broke free, and the lamp flame near the slot bent inward, hard and steady, and the tunnel breathed. The storm eased on the 14th day. Not stopped. The snow continued, but the wind died, and the accumulation slowed from inches per hour to inches per day. Men began to tunnel between buildings. The first path was a trench 2 feet wide and 7 feet deep, connecting Maud's store to the church, and the men who dug it came out the other end blinking in the gray light like men emerging from underground. The damage was visible in the mathematics of destruction. 3 roofs collapsed fully, 7 chimneys broken. Maud's store roof sagging inward along the ridge. The church vestry buried under a drift so deep that the door would not be found until spring. 2 mules dead in a lean-to that had folded like paper under the weight. A prospector's cabin at the upper end of camp had disappeared entirely, its occupant pulled from the wreckage by neighbors who found him by following the sound of his coughing. Isaac's adit had lost the outer section of the snow trench and 1 length of stovepipe. The bulkhead stood. The door hung. The intake slot breathed. The rear chamber read 46 degrees on the thermometer. 17 people had passed through the refuge at the peak of the storm. 17 people who had breathed its air, shared its food, burned its wood, and slept on its stone floor while the mountain held the sky above their heads. Isaac stood at the portal in the gray light and watched men dig. Behind him, the tunnel was empty for the first time in 2 weeks. The stove had gone cold. The water pan was still liquid. He put his hand against the wall where his father had put his hand years before, in a different tunnel, in a different time, and felt the rock hold its own weather. Amos Quayle stood before the council table 3 days after the tunnels connected the buildings. His broken rib made him hold his left arm against his side, and his frostbitten ear had blistered and begun to peel in a way that made men look away when he turned his head. He did not sit. He spoke standing, because sitting hurt more than standing, and because what he had to say needed the weight of a man on his feet. "I told that boy he had a hole," Quayle said. I was wrong. He had the only roof in this camp that did not need shoveling. The room was Maud's store, cleared of barrels and sacks to make space for the dozen men who served as Animus Fork's informal government. Maud sat behind the counter with his ledger open and his pen uncapped, recording minutes he would later use however they served him. Isaac was not present. Nobody had invited him. Quayle continued. He did not flatter Isaac. He did not call the boy brilliant or brave or any of the words men used when they wanted to feel generous without doing anything. He spoke in the language of a mine inspector cataloging facts. The bulkhead held under 14 days of continuous snow load. The portal was buried to a depth of 9 feet at peak accumulation. The interior temperature did not fall below 42 degrees at any point during occupancy. The stove consumed less than 1/4 quart of wood for the duration. The ventilation system maintained breathable air for 17 occupants at peak capacity. No structural failure occurred at any point in the wall, the door, the vent channels, or the drainage system. He looked at the men around the table. 3 roofs in this camp failed completely. 7 chimneys broke. 1 cabin was buried to the ridgepole. 2 mules froze. Mrs. Sutter's porch crushed her wash tub and would have crushed her daughter if the girl had been sleeping there instead of at the Bell cabin. He paused. The mountain did not fail. Our buildings did. Maud's pen scratched. He wrote everything down because writing gave him power. The power to edit, to reframe, to decide what the record said when memory softened. I recommend, Quayle said, that this council acknowledge the boy's claim as a legitimate winter shelter and cease any effort to revoke or purchase it under distress. The motion passed 7-3, with Maud abstaining. He abstained because voting against it in front of men whose families Isaac had sheltered would have cost him more than the vote was worth. The conversions came in different shapes, the way truth enters different people through different doors. Rafe Bell came to the tunnel the day after the council meeting. He did not bring his father's mule, he brought his father. Thomas Bell was 43, a teamster who had driven ore wagons on the Stony Pass Road for 6 years and who believed in the things he could see working: timber, iron, horsepower, and fire. He had forbidden Rafe to help Isaac because helping a boy build inside a mine was helping a boy die, and Thomas Bell had buried 1 child already, an infant son, 2 winters before, and did not intend to watch his surviving children attach themselves to another funeral. He stood inside the tunnel and said nothing for a long time. He touched the bulkhead wall. He opened and closed the door. He looked at the stovepipe channel and the intake slot and the drainage trench that ran the full length of the floor. He read the thermometer. 49 degrees, 3 days after the storm's end, with no fire burning. "How did you know the rock would hold that temperature?" Thomas Bell asked. "I measured it," Isaac said. "Every 20 paces, every day, for 3 weeks before I built the first course." "And the air?" "The tunnel draws through a fracture system I have not found. The air enters somewhere above and behind the rear chamber and exits through the portal. The bulkhead and the vent slots control how fast it moves." Thomas Bell looked at his son. Rafe looked at his boots. "My boy brought you a mule," Thomas Bell said. "He did." "I forbade it." "He did it anyway." Thomas Bell nodded slowly. It was the nod of a man reassessing not just a situation, but the people in it. The boy who had built the wall and the son who had defied his father to help. "What do you need?" Thomas Bell asked. "Nothing now. But if you know anyone with a played-out adit on dry rock with good air, I can tell them whether it is worth inspecting." The visits multiplied. A miner named Creed with a prospect hole behind his cabin that he had always considered useless. A widow named Mrs. Falk, whose root cellar had flooded during the storm, and who wanted to know if digging deeper would help or drown her. Two Swedes from the upper camp who had a horizontal tunnel cut for a speculative claim that had never produced, and who asked whether stone walls and a stove could make it livable. Isaac did not sell the information. He walked each site with his thermometer and his father's watch, and the knowledge Jory had given him, and he told people what he found. Some sites were usable, most were not. The Creed prospect was too shallow, only 40 feet of penetration, and the temperature dropped with the outside air. "You would be building a cold cellar, not a shelter," Isaac told Creed. "The rock needs to be deep enough that the surface temperature cannot reach it. 40 feet is not enough." The widow's root cellar was wet from a spring that could not be diverted without blasting. Isaac told her the truth. "No amount of trenching will keep this dry. The water comes from below, not from the walls. You need a different location." The Swede's tunnel was promising. 80 feet of horizontal penetration into dry granite, with a slight upward grade that shed water naturally. The temperature read 47 at the rear. The air moved not as strongly as Isaac's adit, but enough to sustain a fire if the vents were built correctly. Isaac drew the plan on a piece of crate wood with charcoal. Rear sleeping chamber, drainage trench, bulkhead set back from the portal, small door, 2 vent paths, stove against the far wall. It was the same plan he had drawn in the dirt outside his own portal weeks before the storm, refined now by experience and failure and Jory's corrections. He drew it with Jory sitting beside him. The old Cornishman had survived the storm in his own cabin, a well-built structure with a steep roof and a stove that worked, the kind of conventional shelter Quayle had described as necessary. Jory had not needed Isaac's tunnel, but he had spent the storm listening to his roof creak and coughing into rags that came away darker each day, and when the digging parties connected the buildings, Jory had walked to Isaac's portal before he walked anywhere else. He corrected 3 things on the cratewood plan. The intake slot was too wide. Isaac had drawn it at 8 inches, and Jory narrowed it to 5. "You are not ventilating a stope," Jory said. "You are breathing. 5 inches moves enough air for a family. 8 inches moves enough to cool the chamber faster than the stove can warm it." The stove placement was wrong. Isaac had put it against the far wall, and Jory moved it to the center of the rear chamber. Heat rises and spreads from the center. Against the wall, half your warmth goes into stone. In the center, it reaches the people. The door height was correct, but Jory added a detail Isaac had not considered, a stone threshold raised 4 inches above the floor. "Water follows the lowest path. If meltwater runs through the trench and overflows at the door, the threshold keeps it from entering the sleeping chamber. 4 inches of stone saves your flour." Isaac redrew the plan. The Swedes took it and began work the following week. Maud's response to the validation was not graceful. It was the response of a man watching power shift and reaching for the levers he still controlled. He argued before the council that the adit was town property, deeded under the relief committee's authority, and that Isaac's occupancy was therefore subject to municipal oversight. The argument had a surface logic. The committee had assigned the deed, so the committee retained jurisdiction over how the property was used. Nora Pell dismantled the argument in 10 minutes. She had walked to the assay office in Silverton, 11 miles in the snow, carrying bread in her coat pockets and a list of questions in her head, and found the ledger copy of the committee's original resolution. The language was plain. Isaac had accepted the Grouse Blind No. 2 claim in full settlement of unpaid wages and accumulated board charges owed to the estate of Rowan Vale, deceased. Settlement, full settlement. The deed was not a gift from the town. It was payment for a debt the town owed Isaac's dead father. She read the language aloud at the council table. Maud's pen stopped moving. Settlement is not charity, Nora said. The town owed the boy's father $19.60. They paid him with a mine nobody wanted. That is a transaction, not a favor. The deed is his. Maud looked at her the way he looked at anyone who took something he wanted and held it where he could not reach. He did not argue further that day, but his pen moved again after she left, and the minutes he recorded did not include her words. Isaac heard about it from Rafe. He found Nora at the telegraph office the next afternoon and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and the cold reddening his ears. "You walk to Silverton," he said. "I walk to Silverton twice a week for the telegraph. This time I stopped at the assay office." "Why?" She looked at him with the expression of a person who considers a question too obvious to deserve a long answer. "Because Maud keeps minutes," she said. "And minutes are only as honest as the man who writes them." She went back to copying messages. Isaac stood in the doorway for another few seconds, then put his hat on and left. But he came back the next day and asked if she needed help carrying the message pouch, and the day after that, and the day after that, and neither of them called it anything other than walking. Jory and Isaac inspected the second abandoned adit together on a cold morning in early December. The tunnel was 100 yards up the valley from Isaac's, a shorter bore, maybe 60 feet, driven into softer rock with visible seams and a floor that held standing water in every depression. Isaac's lamp guttered hard to the left the moment they entered. The air was moving, but not the way it moved in his own tunnel, not a steady draw from rear to front, but a sideways pull that shifted direction every few seconds, as if the mountain could not decide which way to breathe. "This one breathes wrong," Isaac said. Jory nodded. He tapped the ceiling at 10-foot intervals. The first 3 taps rang hollow. The fourth produced a flat, dead sound that made him step back. "Rotten stone," Jory said. "See the color change? That dark band is water damage. Freeze-thaw has been working this seam for years. Build a fire in here, and the heat accelerates the cycle. The ceiling sheds within weeks. So it cannot be used. Not as a shelter, might serve as cold storage if you reinforce the first 40 feet. But nobody sleeps under rotten stone." They walked back out. Isaac made a charcoal mark on the portal, a diagonal slash, meaning dangerous. Do not enter without inspection. Jory watched him make the mark and said, "Your father used to mark bad sections the same way." "I know. I learned it from watching him." "You learned more than you think you did." They walked back down the trail in silence. Jory's breathing was worse. The sound of air entering and leaving his lungs had changed over the past weeks, from a faint rasp to a wet, crackling noise that Isaac could hear from 6 feet away. Jory did not cough as much as before. Isaac understood eventually that this was not improvement. The coughing stopped when the lungs became too stiff to expel what was filling them. They worked together on the Swede's tunnel for 2 weeks. Jory could no longer carry stone, but he could sit on a rock and tell Isaac and the 2 Swedes where to place each course, how to batter the wall, where to set the through stones, how to pack the hearting. His hands moved as he spoke, shaping the air into walls that his body could no longer build. One afternoon, the older Swede, Assur, a man named Peter Tveit, laid a corner that was beautiful. The stones met at a clean right angle, the faces flush, the joint tight. It looked like something a mason would frame and hang on a wall. Jory told him to tear it down. Peter stared. "It is perfect," he said. "It is pretty," Jory said. Pretty stones lie. That corner is two face stones meeting at an angle with nothing behind them. Push it, and the whole thing folds. He pointed to a stack of ugly, angular stones that Isaac had sorted to the side. Use those. They are shaped wrong, which means they lock. A beautiful wall is a wall that holds, not a wall that smiles at you. Pater tore down the corner and rebuilt it with the ugly stones. It was not beautiful. It was solid. Isaac watched Jory teach, and he understood that what Jory was doing was not instruction. It was transmission. The old man was placing his knowledge into other people's hands the way a mason places stones into a wall, each piece positioned so that it carried weight, so that it held the piece above it, so that the structure stood after the builder walked away. Jory walked away on the 9th of January, not walked. Jory died on the 9th of January, sitting in his chair beside his cabin stove, with his boots on and his coat buttoned, and a mason's chalk line coiled in his coat pocket. Isaac found him in the afternoon when he came to help stack coal. The cabin was warm. The stove was still burning. Jory's hands were resting on the arms of the chair, and his eyes were closed, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had sat down to rest and decided that resting was enough. Isaac stood in the doorway for a long time. Snow fell outside. The stove ticked. The chalk line in Jory's pocket was visible, a loop of white string poking from the wool like a question left unfinished. Isaac took the chalk line. He closed Jory's cabin door. He walked back to the tunnel through the snow, moving slowly, not because the trail was difficult, but because each step was a step further from the man who had taught him that a wall is not a face, that ugly stones hold, that a big door is pride, and that you test with lamp smoke before sleeping, because the difference between breathing and dying is a flame that leans the wrong direction. He hung the chalk line above the bulkhead door, beside his father's cracked thermometer, and sat on the sleeping platform in the dark, and the mountain held its silence around him the way it had held everything else, steady, patient, indifferent to grief, carrying the weight without complaint. The secondary crisis came in March, carried by the same force that had saved Isaac in January, the mountain itself. Spring thaw in the San Juan country did not arrive gently. It came in surges, 3 days of sun that turned the snowpack to rivers, followed by a freeze that sealed the water under fresh ice, followed by more sun that released the trapped melt all at once. The ground, frozen solid for 4 months, could not absorb the water. It ran downhill in sheets, following every crack, every trench, every low point in the terrain, searching for the path of least resistance to the valley floor. The Bell family's root cellar had been deepened in February. Thomas Bell, following the general shape of Isaac's plan, but not all of its details, had cut the cellar 3 feet deeper and lined it with flat stones. He had built a stone wall across the entrance and a small door. He had not built a drainage trench because the cellar had been dry when he dug it, and dry ground in February felt permanent to a man who had never studied how water moved through frozen earth. Isaac had told him to trench. Thomas Bell had said the ground was dry. The meltwater found the cellar on the 5th of March. It entered through seams in the rock that had been invisible under frozen ground, hairline cracks that opened as the frost retreated, channels that connected the snowpack above to the void below. The water rose 2 inches in the first hour. Thomas Bell bailed with buckets and called it manageable. It rose 2 more inches in the second hour. By the third hour, the water was 8 inches deep and rising, and the cellar held 2 people who could not get out: Millie Bell, who had been organizing stored food tins, and a boy named Asa Pell, Nora's younger brother, 12 years old, who had been helping carry sacks. The stone wall across the entrance was holding the water in. The small door, built tight against the frame, had swelled with moisture and jammed. Millie and Asa were standing in rising water with no exit, and the water had nowhere to go because the cellar had no drainage, and the wall had no weepholes, and the door would not open inward against the weight of water pressing against it. Thomas Bell was hammering on the door when Isaac arrived. Rafe was beside him, wild-eyed, holding a pry bar that was too short to reach the door's hinges. Mrs. Bell was standing at the top of the cellar stairs, shouting instructions that were not instructions but prayers. Isaac looked at the cellar. He looked at the rock face above it. He looked at the seams in the wall where water seeped through the joints. Jory's voice in his head. Water follows the lowest path. Stop hammering, Isaac said. Thomas Bell turned. His face was the face of a father watching the ground swallow his daughter for the second time that winter. Stop hammering, Isaac said again. You're driving the door tighter into the frame. Every hit seats it deeper. Then how do we open it? We do not open it. We drain the water. Isaac looked at the rock face beside the cellar entrance. The stone was fractured, not rotten, not dangerous, but seemed enough that a chisel could find a path. If he could cut a drainage notch through the base of the cellar wall, a gap 2 inches wide at the floor level, the water would pour out through the gap instead of pressing against the door, reduce the water pressure, and the door would open. But the notch had to go through the stone wall's lowest course, and the lowest course was underwater, and cutting stone underwater with a chisel was work that required kneeling in the flow with your face inches from the surface, and above the cutting line was a seam that Jory would have tapped and listened to and possibly marked with his diagonal slash. Isaac could cut from above. He could remove courses from the top of the wall, working down, staying dry and safe. But every course he removed weakened the wall against the water pressure, and if the wall shifted before the water drained, the collapse would send stones into the cellar where 2 children were standing. He could cut from below, kneel in the water, chisel the lowest course, create the notch, faster, more dangerous. The seam above his head might hold. It might not. He chose below. He braced the seam first, a lagging board wedged between the wall and the ceiling, pressed tight with stone shims, the way Jory had taught him to brace suspect rock before working beneath it. The brace would not stop a full ceiling collapse, but it would deflect a single slab long enough for a man to pull his head clear. Then he knelt in the water and began to cut. The chisel rang against the stone in sharp, quick strokes. Water ran over his wrists and soaked his sleeves to the elbows. The cold was immediate and total. His hands numbed within minutes, and he had to stop twice to press his fingers against his stomach and force blood back into them. The notch widened stroke by stroke. 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 1.5 inches. At 2 inches, the water found the gap. It poured through the notch in a flat, hard stream that sprayed across the ground outside the cellar and ran downhill toward the creek. The level inside began to drop. Isaac kept cutting, widening the notch to 3 inches, 4, until the flow was a torrent, and the water inside the cellar was dropping visibly, inch by inch, and he could hear Millie shouting that her feet were clearing the surface. Thomas Bell got the door open when the water level dropped below the threshold. Millie and Asa stumbled out, soaked to the waist, shivering, but breathing. Asa was crying in the silent, gulping way of a boy who had been certain he was going to die and was not yet sure he had not. Nora arrived as they were wrapping the children in dry blankets. She had run from the telegraph office, 1/2 mile uphill in mud, and her boots were caked and her breath came in torn gasps. She looked at Asa, looked at Isaac kneeling beside the notch with the chisel still in his hand and water running over his knees, and for a moment the expression on her face was something Isaac could not read and did not try to name. "You cut the wall," she said. "The door would not open against the pressure. You cut through the base, in the water. Jory taught me to find the lowest path." She looked at the lagging board braced against the ceiling. She looked at the seam above it. She understood what he had done, not just the cut, but the brace, the risk calculation, the decision to go below instead of above. "Jory is dead," she said, "and you are still using his lessons. That is what lessons are for. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it." The rescue changed the mathematics of Isaac's position in Animus Forks. He had not sought authority. He had not asked anyone to trust him, but twice now, once in the storm, once in the flood, he had been the person who understood what the mountain was doing before the mountain finished doing it, and twice he had been right when the people who dismissed him had been wrong. People came to him now, not with the skepticism of the first weeks, when his tunnel was a joke, not with the desperate need of the storm, when his tunnel was the last shelter standing. They came with questions, practical questions, asked by practical people who had survived a winter that punished everyone who did not listen to the ground beneath their feet. Could a root cellar be deepened safely? Depends on the rock. Show me. Could a prospect hole serve as storage? How deep? What is the air like? Is the floor wet or dry? Could a stone windbreak be built to protect the east wall of a cabin? Yes, but batter it inward and tie the courses through. Isaac inspected 4 sites in the 2 weeks after the flood. He rejected 2, one too wet, one with rotten ceiling rock that shed flakes when he tapped. He approved 2 with modifications, drainage trenches, vent paths, bulkhead walls built by Isaac and the site owners working together. He did not charge for the work. He traded labor for labor, knowledge for food, inspection for help carrying timber. He taught 3 families to tap ceilings and mark unsafe seams. He showed the widow, Mrs. Falk, how to read her root cellar's drainage pattern by pouring a bucket of water on the floor and watching which direction it ran. He refused payment from Mrs. Falk, who offered him a jar of preserved berries because he had told her the cellar was not worth improving and taking payment for bad news seemed wrong. Maud watched all of this from behind his counter. His pen moved in the ledger. His face carried the expression of a man performing calculations that never came out in his favor. Isaac's knowledge threatened Maud in ways that had nothing to do with the adit claim. Maud's power in Animus Forks rested on dependency. He owned the store. He owned the boarding house. He extended credit against future wages. When winter came, men who could not shelter themselves came to Maud, and Maud set the terms. $1 a week for a cot, flour at prices that climbed as the road closed, credit that accumulated interest. The town's dependency on conventional shelter, timber, stovewood, purchased supplies, was Maud's business model. A boy who could teach people to shelter inside the mountain for nearly nothing was a threat to the system that fed Maud's ledger. Maud did not confront Isaac directly after the council meeting. He adjusted. He adapted. He looked for the angle that would let him turn Isaac's innovation into his own advantage, and in April he found it. A notice appeared on the wall of Maud's store, written in Maud's careful hand, Maud's Mountain Rooms, storm-safe lodging in natural rock, winter rates available, apply within. He had acquired a shallow adit on the north side of the valley, a wet, unstable prospect hole that had been abandoned after 30 feet of penetration into crumbling sandstone. He had paid nothing for it. The owner had left the camp during the storm and never returned. Maud had nailed boards across the entrance, hung a blanket over the gap, and placed a notice advertising it as winter accommodation for the following season. Isaac read the notice on a Tuesday afternoon. He stood in front of Maud's store with the spring sun on his face and the snow melt running past his boots, and the words storm-safe lodging in natural rock staring at him from the wall. He walked to the north side of the valley and found the adit. He did not enter. He did not need to enter. He could see from the portal that the rock was wrong. Dark, seamed, wet on the ceiling. He could hear the drip pattern that said active water, not residual seep. He could smell the air, and the air smelled like the inside of a well, 30 feet deep, wet floor, crumbling sandstone, no drainage, no vent path, no second air source. A stove in that space would fill it with smoke in minutes. A storm that buried the entrance would leave occupants breathing their own air until they stopped. People would pay Maud for a shelter that could kill them. People who trusted the word storm safe because it was written in the careful hand of a councilman on the wall of the town's only store. People who did not know what Isaac knew, who could not read rock or test air, or understand that a hole in the ground is not a shelter simply because it has a roof. Isaac went back to his tunnel. He sat on the platform in the rear chamber and looked at the chalk line hanging above the door. Jory's chalk line, looped and still, the last thing the old man's hands had touched. The mountain did not care who entered it. The mountain did not distinguish between Isaac's adit and Maud's. It held its temperature, it carried its weight, it breathed through its fractures, and it let water and stone and gravity do what water and stone and gravity would always do. The mountain did not protect. It obeyed its own rules. Isaac had learned the rules. Maud had not. And Maud was selling tickets,